Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Obergefreiter Greta Schneider stared at the olive-green field jacket draped across her shoulders. American, standard issue. Still warm from the soldier's body. 20 minutes ago, she'd been taught that these men were monsters, savages who would do unspeakable things to German women. The propaganda films had been explicit, graphic, terrifying. Now one of them had just taken off his own jacket in the April rain and placed it around her trembling shoulders without a word. She looked down at the fabric. U.S. Army stenciled across the chest, a corporal's stripes on the sleeve, the faint smell of cigarettes and gun oil. Her fingers traced the stitching, trying to reconcile what she'd been told with what was happening. Behind her, 43 other women from her signals unit stood in the muddy courtyard of what used to be a Wehrmacht logistics depot. All of them soaked, all of them terrified, all of them waiting for the nightmare to begin. Instead, American soldiers were moving through the group, handing out blankets, offering cigarettes, speaking in soft tones she couldn't understand. One GI was trying to light a cigarette for an older woman whose hands shook too violently to hold the match. He cupped his hands around hers, patient until the tobacco caught. This wasn't right. This couldn't be real. Everything Greta had been told, everything she'd believed about this moment, it was unraveling with every act of inexplicable kindness. And that jacket on her shoulders felt heavier than any burden she'd carried during 6 years of war. What she was about to discover would shatter not just her expectations, but her entire understanding of who had really lost this war long before the shooting stopped. April 16, 1945. Ansbach, Bavaria, 1437. The rain had been falling for 3 hours when the white flag went up. Obergefreiter Greta Schneider watched it rise through the cracked window of the signals room, a torn bedsheet tied to a broomstick, hoisted by Hauptmann Weber, with hands that shook so badly he needed 2 attempts. The fabric was gray from soot and dirt, but white enough for the Americans to see, white enough to mean the end. She was 22 years old. She had been in uniform for 37 months, and she was absolutely certain she was about to die. "They're coming," whispered Hilda Kurtz, pressed against the wall beside her. Hilda was 19, round-faced, from a farm outside Dresden that no longer existed. Her voice had gone flat 3 days ago when the news came through about the city. "Oh God, Greta, they're coming." Through the window, Greta could see them, American soldiers moving through the rubble-choked streets in loose formation. Not marching, walking, like they were taking a Sunday stroll through hell. Their olive uniforms stood out against the gray devastation of Ansbach, bright and clean and terrifyingly alien. Behind Greta, 41 other women waited in the cold room, signals operators, radio technicians, telegraph clerks. The Wehrmacht's auxiliary units had been called Blitzmädel, lightning girls, back when there had still been lightning. Now they were just cold, hungry, and convinced they had about 30 minutes to live. Greta's right hand found the small photograph in her breast pocket. Her mother, her younger brother Klaus, grinning in his Hitlerjugend uniform, gone now, 18 months, lost somewhere in the snow outside Stalingrad. She traced the cracked edge of the photo through the fabric. The propaganda had been explicit, crystal clear. She'd seen the posters, heard the radio broadcasts, sat through the special briefings. American soldiers were barely human. They raped. They mutilated. They took particular pleasure in degrading German women. The Soviets were worse, but the Americans, the propaganda, had shown photos, bodies, claimed atrocities. The message was unambiguous. Death was preferable to capture. Greta had a small pistol in her bag. A Walther PP, 7 rounds. Officers had been quietly distributing them to female personnel for weeks. "Just in case," they'd said. "For your honor." She hadn't decided yet if she would use it. The door burst open. Hauptmann Weber, pale as old paper, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost 20 kilos. "They want us outside. All personnel. 5 minutes. Leave your weapons." "Hauptmann," Hilda's voice cracked. 5 minutes. He was already gone, moving to the next room. The women looked at each other. No one moved. Greta stood first. Someone had to. She picked up her bag, emptied of the pistol now, lying cold and unused on the desk, and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard the shuffle of 41 pairs of feet following. Outside, the rain hit like cold judgment. They assembled in what used to be the depot's vehicle yard. Now it was a crater-pocked expanse of mud and twisted metal. Shell casings glinted in puddles. The burnt skeleton of a truck smoldered against the east wall. Greta stood in the front row, rain streaming down her face, and watched the Americans form a perimeter around them. Young men, mostly. Younger than she'd expected. Some looked barely 18. They held their rifles casually, not quite pointed at the Germans, but not quite away either. One American soldier, a sergeant, she could see the stripes, was walking along the line of German prisoners, counting. His lips moved silently. When he reached the end, he pulled out a small notebook and wrote something down. Greta realized with distant surprise that they were being processed, counted, organized, not shot. The sergeant walked to the center of the courtyard and said something in English she couldn't understand. His voice carried authority but not anger. He gestured to the German men, about 30 Wehrmacht soldiers, the remnants of the depot's garrison, and then to the women. An American corporal appeared beside Greta's group. He was maybe 25, tall, with mud on his boots and rain beating on his helmet. He looked at the women with an expression Greta couldn't read. Not hatred, not lust. Something else. He said something in English. Soft. Almost apologetic. No one responded. He tried again, slower, as if volume had been the problem. Then he seemed to notice what Greta noticed, that every woman was shaking, not from cold, though it was cold, from terror. The corporal's face changed. He looked back at the sergeant, said something sharp. The sergeant nodded. What happened next would replay in Greta's mind for the rest of her life. The corporal reached up and unbuttoned his field jacket. He shrugged it off, revealing just his uniform shirt underneath, already soaking through in the rain, and walked directly to Greta. She flinched, stepped back. He stopped, held out the jacket, made a gesture, putting it on. Greta stared at him, at the jacket, at his face, which showed nothing but patient concern. The propaganda images flashed through her mind, the warnings, the explicit instructions about what American soldiers would do. The corporal waited. Slowly, so slowly she felt like she was moving through water, Greta reached out and took the jacket. It was still warm, heavy, the fabric rough against her frozen fingers. The corporal nodded, satisfied, and turned back to his unit. Behind Greta, something broke. She heard Hilda start to cry, not from fear now, but from confused relief. Other women were crying, too. One of the older signals operators, Frau Zimmermann, made a sound like a sob and a laugh colliding. More Americans were coming forward now. Blankets appeared, gray wool blankets stamped with U.S. Army. The soldiers were draping them over women's shoulders, offering them with the awkward courtesy of men who'd been taught to respect their mothers and weren't quite sure how to handle 43 terrified enemy combatants who looked like their sisters. One GI pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lucky strikes, Greta noted with surreal precision, and moved down the line, offering them. His German was terrible but recognizable. Zigarette? Zigarette? Most women took them with shaking hands. The GI lit them patiently, one by one, cupping the matches against the rain. Greta pulled the American jacket tighter around her shoulders and felt something fundamental crack in her understanding of the world. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. The prisoner compound was a former Luftwaffe barracks on the edge of town, now flying an American flag where the swastika had hung 3 days ago. They arrived in trucks. American trucks, which ran smoothly and didn't belch black smoke, like every German vehicle Greta had seen in the past year. The women sat in the covered bed, pressed together, wrapped in their American blankets, and said almost nothing. What was there to say? The compound was organized with mechanical precision, rows of barracks, guard towers, concertina wire, but also a field hospital tent, a mess hall with actual smoke coming from the chimney, meaning actual food being cooked, an administrative building with lights on, meaning working electricity. Greta noticed these things in fragments, her mind struggling to process information that contradicted 2 years of propaganda. They were separated by gender, the Wehrmacht men to one section, the women to another. An American officer, a lieutenant with perfect posture and wire-rimmed glasses, addressed them through an interpreter. A German civilian, an older man with careful eyes. "You will be housed in Barracks 7, the interpreter said, his accent marking him as Bavarian. "There are bunks, blankets, and a stove. Food will be distributed at 1800 hours. Medical personnel will examine anyone who needs treatment. You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated accordingly." Geneva Convention. Greta turned the words over in her mind. She'd heard of it vaguely. Something about rules for warfare. She hadn't realized Americans actually followed rules. They filed into Barracks 7. It was clean. That was the first shock. No lice. No rats. No smell of decay. Just empty bunks with thin mattresses and folded blankets stacked at the foot of each bed. A stove in the center, cold but functional, with actual coal in a bin beside it. Hilda touched one of the mattresses like it might disappear. "It's real," she whispered. Frau Zimmermann, who'd been a signal supervisor and maintained her authority through pure force of habit, began organizing sleeping arrangements. 3 to a bunk if needed. We'll rotate who's nearest the stove. Everyone gets equal. "There's a washroom," someone called from the back, "with water, running water." The women moved as a mass toward the rear of the barrack. The washroom was basic, concrete floor, open showers, a row of sinks, but the faucets worked. Water came out, cold but clean. No rust, no sulfur smell. One of the younger women turned on a tap and started crying. Greta stood in the doorway, still wearing the American corporal's jacket, and felt reality continue to fracture around her. If this story surprised you, if it challenged what you thought you knew about that moment in history, hit like to show we need more forgotten truths told. Now let's see what came next. At 18 exactly as promised, American soldiers arrived with food. Not watery soup, not moldy bread, real food. They carried metal containers, steam rising from open lids. The smell hit the women before they could see what was inside. Meat, vegetables, bread that was soft, coffee that smelled like actual coffee. Each woman received a metal tray, American mess trays, divided into sections, and moved through a line where GIs spooned portions with mechanical efficiency. Beef stew, boiled potatoes, carrots, a thick slice of white bread, a pat of butter wrapped in waxed paper. Greta stared at her tray. The last time she'd seen this much food in one place was, she couldn't remember. 1943. Before, she found a spot at one of the long tables and sat. Around her, women ate in stunned silence. Some cried while they ate. Others couldn't eat at all, just stared at their trays like they were hallucinations. Hilda ate 3 bites and vomited into a bucket. "Too rich," Frau Zimmermann said quietly. "Our stomachs can't handle it. Eat slowly." Greta forced herself to take small bites. The meat was tender. Real beef, not horse, not dog, not the mysterious protein the Wehrmacht had been serving for the past 8 months. Just beef, cooked with onions and something that might have been tomato paste. She thought about Klaus. Had he had food like this? Before the end? The American corporal from the courtyard appeared in the doorway. He scanned the room, spotted Greta, and walked over. She tensed. He held out something. A chocolate bar. "Hershey's," the wrapper said. "For you," he said in careful practiced German. His accent was terrible. Greta took it automatically. The corporal nodded and walked away. She looked down at the chocolate bar. Brown wrapper. Silver letters. She hadn't seen chocolate in 2 years. "They're trying to confuse us," said a voice beside her. Greta turned. It was Ingrid Hoffman, one of the radio operators. thin-faced, sharp-eyed, from somewhere in Prussia. This is psychological warfare. Make us comfortable, make us compliant. Then, she didn't finish. Then what? Greta asked. Ingrid had no answer. That night, lying in an actual bunk with an actual blanket, Greta listened to 42 women try to process the unprocessable. Some prayed, some cried. Some whispered theories. This was a trap. This was temporary. This was some elaborate American cruelty. But the bunks were real. The food had been real. The running water was real. Greta touched the American jacket, folded carefully at the foot of her bed. Everything she'd been told was a lie. Or everything she was experiencing now was a lie. One of those had to be true. Both couldn't exist simultaneously, could they? April 18, 1945, 2 days into captivity. The routine established itself with surprising speed. Wake at 06:01, wash, breakfast, always eggs, sometimes with sausage, always with coffee. Roll call at 8:00. Then, nothing. The Americans didn't make them work, didn't interrogate them, just left them alone. Some women mended clothes, others read. The Americans had provided a box of books, German books from somewhere. Goethe, Schiller, even some novels. Nothing political, just books. Greta spent most of her time watching. She watched the American guards change shifts with mechanical precision, watched supply trucks arrive daily with food and equipment, watched medics treat a German prisoner who'd cut his hand on wire, actually treat him with antiseptic and clean bandages, not just let him bleed. On the second afternoon, Frau Zimmermann organized a group to speak with the camp commandant. She chose Greta to come along. "You have the best English," Zimmermann said. "I don't have English," Greta protested. "You have more than the rest of us." They were escorted to the administrative building by a young private who couldn't have been more than 19. He held the door open for them, actually held the door. Inside, the commandant's office was functional but warm. A coal stove burned in the corner. Maps covered the walls. A photograph of President Roosevelt sat on the desk. The commandant was a captain, early 30s from his looks, tired eyes. He stood when they entered. The interpreter, the same Bavarian civilian, was already present. "Please sit," the captain said through the interpreter. He gestured to chairs. They sat. "I understand you have questions," the captain continued. "I'll answer what I can." Zimmermann, never one for small talk. "When will we be released?" "I don't know. That's above my authority. But you'll remain here until higher command decides disposition of all Wehrmacht auxiliary personnel." "How long?" "Weeks. Maybe months." A ripple of dismay went through the German women. "Will we be sent to America?" Greta asked quietly. The captain looked at her directly. "Unlikely. Female auxiliary personnel are considered non-combatants under the Geneva Convention. You'll probably be processed and released to civilian authority once the occupation government is established." "We'll be released?" Hilda's voice was small. "Yes." The captain said it like it was obvious. "You're not soldiers. You are performing administrative functions. Once you're processed and verified, yes, you'll be released." Silence. "Is there anything else?" the captain asked. Zimmermann found her voice. "Why are you treating us like this?" The captain's expression didn't change. "Like what?" "Like people." The captain looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something in English to the interpreter. The interpreter looked uncomfortable but translated, "Because you are people, and we're not monsters." That night, Greta couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the captain's words, the simplicity of them, the matter-of-fact delivery. We're not monsters. But the propaganda had been so clear, so detailed, the photographs, the testimonies, the explicit warnings. Had it all been lies? Or, and this thought made her physically ill, had she been part of something so terrible that even the enemy looked humane by comparison? She thought about the past 6 years, the rallies she'd attended, the speeches she'd cheered, the uniforms she'd been proud to wear, the cause she'd believed in. What had that cause done? She didn't sleep. April 22nd, 1945. 6 days into captivity. The screaming started at 02:30. Greta jerked awake to find the barrack in chaos. Someone was having a nightmare, loud, violent, incoherent. She recognized the voice. Anna Gerst, a telegraph operator, only 18. Zimmerman and 2 others were trying to wake her. Anna fought them, still locked in whatever horror her mind had conjured. "Get the Americans," Zimmerman snapped. The guard came immediately. He took one look at Anna, thrashing, screaming, eyes open but seeing nothing, and ran. 2 minutes later, he was back with a medic. The medic was a corporal with a red cross on his helmet. He carried a medical bag and moved with practiced calm. He knelt beside Anna's bunk, checked her pulse, looked at her eyes. "Shock," he said in English, then tried German. "Shock." He pulled out a syringe, measured something from a small bottle, and injected Anna's arm. Within 30 seconds, her screaming faded to whimpers. Within a minute, she was unconscious. The medic stayed for 10 minutes, monitoring her breathing, her pulse. Then he left instructions with Zimmerman. "Watch her, keep her warm, get him immediately if anything changes," and departed. Greta lay back down, but didn't close her eyes. In the morning, Anna was taken to the field hospital. Greta volunteered to go with her. The field hospital was a revelation. It occupied 3 large tents connected by canvas corridors. Inside, beds with white sheets. Medical equipment Greta couldn't identify. Electric lights. The smell of antiseptic instead of gangrene. A nurse, an American woman, a lieutenant, led them to a bed where Anna lay sedated. The nurse checked her chart, adjusted an IV bag hanging beside the bed. "She'll be fine," the nurse said through an interpreter who'd materialized from somewhere. "Severe exhaustion and malnutrition. We're giving her fluids and letting her rest. She can return to your barrack tomorrow." Greta stared at the IV bag. Clear fluid dripping through a tube into Anna's arm. "What is that?" she asked. "Saline solution. Salt water, basically. She's dehydrated." Salt water administered through a tube directly into the veins. Greta had heard of such things, but never seen them. German field hospitals, the ones still functioning, barely had bandages. The nurse noticed Greta's stare. "Would you like to look around? We have a few minutes before the morning rush." Greta nodded, mute. The nurse led her through the ward. Bed after bed of patients, some German, some American, no apparent separation. A German soldier with a chest wound lay next to an American GI with a bandaged leg. Both were receiving identical care. "We treat everyone," the nurse said, noticing Greta's confusion. "Doesn't matter whose side they were on. A patient is a patient." They passed a table stacked with supplies, bottles, boxes, more medical equipment than Greta had seen in her entire time with the Wehrmacht. One bottle caught her eye. The label, penicillin. She stopped. "What is it?" the nurse asked. "That," Greta pointed. "Penicillin. Yes, we have about 200 doses, more coming next week." Greta's knees went weak. 200? Is something wrong? How could she explain? How could she make this American woman understand that in Germany, penicillin was worth more than gold? That men died, thousands of them, for infections that one dose could cure? That the entire Wehrmacht Medical Corps had maybe 50 doses for the entire front? And here it sat on a table in a field hospital. 200 doses, treated like aspirin. "Nothing," Greta whispered. "Nothing is wrong." But everything was wrong, or everything had been wrong, or she didn't know anymore. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story that official history forgot. Now, watch how this realization spreads. That afternoon, Greta returned to the field hospital. She told Zimmerman she wanted to check on Anna. That was partly true. But mainly she needed to see the place again, to confirm she hadn't imagined it. Anna was awake eating soup, real soup with vegetables. She looked better, color in her face, clarity in her eyes. "They gave me 3 meals, Anna said, wonder in her voice. 3 meals in one day, Greta, and medicine. They said my blood is anemic and they're giving me iron pills." Iron pills. Yes, these little brown capsules twice a day with food. Iron for anemia, not rest more or eat better when food is available. Actual treatment. Greta sat beside Anna's bed and tried to reconcile everything. A German doctor appeared, a prisoner from his armband, working in the hospital. He was maybe 50, gray-haired, with careful movements that spoke of long experience. "You're Gerst's friend?" he asked. "Yes." "She'll be fine. 2 more days of fluids and decent food. She'll be strong enough to return to your barrack." He paused. "You're the signals operator, Schneider, yes?" "Yes." "Can I ask you something?" Greta nodded. The doctor sat down, spoke quietly. "How long have you been in the auxiliary service?" 3 years, since 42. "And before that?" "I was a student, technical school in Munich." The doctor nodded slowly. "So you remember, before the war, before everything?" "Yes." "Then tell me honestly, when you were a student, before the party, before the rhetoric, before the uniforms, did you think any of this was possible?" "Any of what?" The doctor gestured around the hospital. "This. The Americans having so much of everything that they can give penicillin to enemy prisoners like it's candy. Having so much food their soldiers are fat. Having so much fuel they run heated tents for captives." Greta opened her mouth, closed it. "I've been a doctor for 28 years, he continued. "I've worked in Berlin, Munich, Vienna. Good hospitals. Before the war, we were proud of German medicine, German science, German efficiency." His voice dropped. "And now I watch American medics, boys who were probably delivering milk 2 years ago, use equipment I've only read about in journals. I watch them waste supplies I would have killed for when I was treating our own wounded." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we lost this war a long time ago, Fräulein. Long before the tanks stopped rolling. We lost it when we believed our own propaganda about superiority." He stood up. "The Americans didn't beat us because they were cruel or savage. They beat us because they had so much of everything that they could afford to be kind." He walked away, leaving Greta sitting beside Anna's bed, staring at the IV drip, at the stacked supplies, at the casual abundance that surrounded her. The terrible truth was crystallizing. Germany hadn't just lost a war. Germany had been fighting a war it could never win, against an enemy with such overwhelming resources that they could afford to be generous to prisoners, against a system so productive that waste was affordable, against a philosophy that treated even enemies as human beings, deserving of medicine and food and dignity. And she had believed, they had all believed, that they were the superior ones. April 29th, 1945, 13 days into captivity. The photographs arrived on a Thursday. No warning, no preparation, just an announcement at morning roll call. All prisoners were to report to the mess hall immediately for a mandatory briefing. The women filed in, confused. Mandatory briefings meant trouble, or bad news. Or American officers stood at the front of the hall. The camp commandant, 2 other captains, and a man in civilian clothes, a war correspondent from his camera and press badge. The commandant spoke through the interpreter. "What you are about to see is real. It was documented by U.S. Army photographers over the past 2 weeks. We are showing you this because we believe you have a right to know what was done in your name." A screen was set up, a projector. The lights went out. The first photograph appeared. Greta didn't understand what she was seeing at first. The image was black and white. It showed piles of something. Clothing, maybe? Or the second photograph came into focus. Not clothing, bodies. Hundreds of them, skeletal, stacked like firewood, naked, faces frozen in final agony. The third photograph, living people who looked worse than the dead, prisoners in striped uniforms, skin stretched over bones, eyes like holes, standing behind wire, staring at the camera with expressions beyond despair. The caption appeared beneath, Buchenwald, April 11, 1945. Fourth photograph, a pile of children's shoes, thousands of them, small shoes, baby shoes, children's shoes in a mountain that reached higher than a man's head. Fifth, bodies in an oven, human bodies, being burned like trash. Greta couldn't breathe. The photographs kept coming. Different camps, same horror, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Nordhausen, names she'd heard vaguely, never quite knowing what they were. Now she knew, photographs of experiments, medical experiments on living prisoners, photographs of gas chambers, photographs of execution walls still stained with blood and brain matter, photographs of survivors who looked like walking corpses holding up their sleeves to show tattooed numbers. Somewhere behind Greta, someone was vomiting. Someone else was crying. Hilda's hand found Greta's and gripped it hard enough to hurt. The photographs kept coming. 20 minutes of them. 20 minutes of methodical, systematic, documented horror. When the lights came back on, Greta couldn't see. Her eyes wouldn't focus. The after-images of skeletal bodies were burned into her retinas. The commandant's voice, soft now, almost gentle. These camps were liberated by American and British forces over the past month. What you saw was real. The prisoners you saw were real. The methods of killing were real. This was done by the government you served, by the nation you fought for, by the system you supported. Silence in the hall, total, complete, the silence of a world ending. We're showing you this, the commandant continued, not to be cruel, not to humiliate you, but because you will return to Germany soon. You will live among the German people. And when they say, "We didn't know," you cannot say that, because now you do know. The prisoners were dismissed. Greta walked back to the barrack in a trance. Around her, women stumbled like the wounded. Some were still crying. Others had gone completely blank, shock shutting down everything that made them human. In the barrack, no one spoke for an hour. Finally, Ingrid Hoffmann, the sharp-eyed Prussian who'd warned this was all psychological warfare, said in a cracked voice, "It can't be real. It's propaganda. American propaganda to—" "Shut up," Zimmerman said. She was sitting on her bunk, staring at nothing. "Just shut up, Ingrid." "But they could have faked thousands of photographs." Zimmerman's voice broke into a scream. "Thousands, with hundreds of photographers, with British confirmation, with German survivors. You think they faked all of that in 3 weeks?" Ingrid had no answer. "We knew," Zimmerman whispered. "We had to have known. Maybe not the details, maybe not the scale, but we knew something was happening to the Jews, to the Slavs, to everyone they said was inferior." "I didn't know," someone protested weakly. "We didn't want to know," Zimmerman corrected. "We heard the rumors and we didn't ask questions. We saw people disappearing and we told ourselves it was none of our business. We believed we were the victims. We were the superior race. We were fighting for survival. And all of it was a lie built on mountains of corpses." Greta sat on her bunk, still wearing the American corporal's jacket. She'd started wearing it every day, drawn to its solid reality, and felt the last pieces of her worldview shatter into dust. The Americans hadn't been kind because they were weak. They'd been kind because they'd already won. Not just militarily, morally, philosophically, in every way that mattered. They could afford to be generous because they weren't fighting to prove they were superior. They didn't need to be cruel because their sense of self-worth didn't depend on subjugating others. They gave food to prisoners because they had so much food that generosity cost them nothing. They treated wounded enemies because their medical supplies were so abundant that saving lives was practical, not aspirational. They gave jackets to cold women because they were still human beings under the uniform. And nothing, not 6 years of war, not propaganda, not any ideology, had managed to strip that humanity away. While Germany had built its identity on a lie of superiority that required constant proof through degradation and destruction. Greta touched the American jacket. Who had won? The question answered itself. May 8th, 1945. 22 days into captivity. Germany surrendered. The announcement came over loudspeakers at 15 first in English, then in German. The European war was over. All German military forces had ceased hostilities. The Third Reich was dissolved. In the prisoner compound, no one celebrated. What was there to celebrate? The death of everything they'd believed in? The confirmation that 6 years of sacrifice had been for a lie? The Americans celebrated. Greta could hear them outside the wire, cheering, music, the occasional gunshot fired into the air in joy. They'd earned it. They'd won. That night, the American soldiers shared their celebration rations with the prisoners. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, even bottles of beer. The guards handed them through the wire with grins, with victory in their eyes but no malice. Greta accepted a Hershey's bar from the same corporal who'd given her his jacket. He said something in English she didn't understand, but his tone was clear. We did it. It's over. You can go home now. Home. Greta tried to remember what that word meant. Munich? Her mother's apartment had probably been bombed to rubble. Her neighborhood, she'd heard it was gone, destroyed in the raids of '44. Germany itself? What was Germany now? A concept, a graveyard, a crime scene. She bit into the chocolate bar. It was sweet, too sweet. It made her want to cry. May 15, 1945. The releases began. The Wehrmacht men went first, processed, documented, sent to larger POW camps to await final disposition. Then, the women. Frau Zimmermann was called on the third day. She'd been designated a supervisor, but the Americans had decided she was still non-combatant. She was given a discharge paper, a travel permit, and sent on her way. Anna Gerst left on the 5th day. Hilda on the 6th. Greta was called on the 8th day. She stood before a processing desk in the administrative building. An American lieutenant reviewed her file. Obergefreiter Greta Schneider, he read through the interpreter. 22 years old, signals operator. No evidence of war crimes, no evidence of party membership beyond mandatory Hitler Youth. Greta said nothing. You're free to go, the lieutenant said. You'll be given a discharge document, a travel permit for Bavaria, and 3 days of rations. Do you have somewhere to go? Did she? Munich, Greta said. I'll try Munich. The lieutenant nodded and stamped her papers. At the gate, an American sergeant handed her a small bundle. The rations, canned meat, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes for trading. And folded on top, the olive green field jacket. Greta stared at it. From Corporal Jensen, the sergeant said in halting German. He says you keep it. Still cold at night. Greta took the jacket. She tried to say thank you, but her throat had closed. The gate opened. She walked through it, into a Germany she no longer recognized, carrying the jacket of an enemy who had shown her more humanity than her own nation ever had. October 17, 1962, Munich, 17 years later. Greta Schneider, now Greta Hartmann, married 13 years, mother of 2, sat at her kitchen table with a letter. The return address was American, Massachusetts, a name she didn't recognize. Michael Jensen. She opened it with shaking hands. The letter was in English. Her English had improved considerably since the war. She'd taken classes, worked as a translator for the occupation government, built a new life from the ashes of the old one. Dear Frau Hartmann, you don't know me, but I'm writing on behalf of my father, Corporal Daniel Jensen, who passed away last month. Among his effects, we found a diary from his service in Germany in 1945. He wrote about giving his jacket to a German prisoner, a young woman, a signals operator, during the processing of prisoners in Ansbach. He never forgot her face or the terror in her eyes. My father struggled after the war. He saw things that haunted him, the camps, the destruction, the human cost of it all. But he always said that moment, giving his jacket to a frightened enemy soldier, reminded him why we'd fought, not to destroy, but to prove that decency could survive even the worst that humanity could do to itself. I found your name in his diary. I don't know if you're the same person, but if you are, my father wanted you to know. He never regretted his choice. He hoped the jacket kept you warm. He hoped you made it home safely. He hoped you found peace. The world is still complicated, still full of fear and misunderstanding. But my father believed that small acts of humanity matter. They add up. They change things in ways we can't always measure. Thank you for being part of his story. Sincerely, Michael Jensen. Greta set the letter down. She walked to her bedroom closet and opened it. In the back, wrapped in paper, was the jacket. She'd kept it, through the occupation, through the reconstruction, through marriage and children and the slow, painful rebuilding of a nation and a life. She'd never been able to throw it away. The jacket was worn now, the fabric thin, the OD green faded to gray-green, but the stitching was still there. U.S. Army. The corporal's stripes. Her daughter, Eva, appeared in the doorway, 15 years old, born into a different Germany. A Germany rebuilt on the ashes of the old one. A Germany that had faced its crimes and chosen, painfully, imperfectly, to be different. "Mama? What's that?" Greta looked at her daughter. At this girl who would never know the terror of air raids, never know the hunger of the war years, never know the crushing weight of propaganda that could make you believe lies were truth. "A reminder," Greta said quietly. "Of what?" Greta touched the faded jacket, remembered the rain, the terror, the impossible kindness, the photographs, the moment everything she believed crumbled and something new, painful but real, took its place. "Of the fact that no ideology is stronger than simple human decency," she said, "and that the side with enough resources to be kind will always defeat the side that can only afford to be cruel." Eva looked confused. Someday, Greta would explain, someday, when Eva was old enough to understand complexity, to understand that Greta's generation had been both victims and perpetrators, that they'd been lied to and believed the lies, that they'd enabled horrors through passivity and found humanity in the ruins. But for now, Greta just held the jacket and remembered. Remembered Daniel Jensen taking off his jacket in the rain. Remembered the penicillin on the hospital shelf. Remembered the photographs that destroyed her world. Remembered learning that victory wasn't just measured in tanks and troops, but in whether you could feed your enemies, heal their wounded, and still see them as human after 6 years of being told they were monsters. Between April and May 1945, as the Wehrmacht collapsed, American forces captured hundreds of thousands of German military personnel, including approximately 500,000 women serving in auxiliary roles. The Nachrichtenhelferinnen, signals, Stabshelferinnen, staff assistants, and various other support units. The propaganda these women had been exposed to was explicit. American soldiers would rape, torture, and murder German women. The Nazis distributed specific instructions suggesting suicide was preferable to capture. What actually happened was documented in thousands of photographs, film reels, and written accounts by both American servicemen and German prisoners. American soldiers, despite having just fought through some of the bloodiest campaigns in history, despite having seen the concentration camps, despite having every reason for vengeance, shared their rations, gave up their jackets and blankets, provided immediate medical care, treated prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, even when their own forces were still taking casualties. This wasn't universal. There were incidents, crimes, failures of discipline. War is never clean. But the overwhelming pattern was one of basic human decency, maintained under extraordinary circumstances. The numbers tell part of the story. American POW camps in Germany, 1945. Death rate of 0.15% Soviet camps. Death rate approaching 30 to 40% German camps for Soviet prisoners. Death rate of 57.5%. The difference wasn't just policy. It was resources. The United States entered the war with an industrial capacity that dwarfed Germany's. By 1945, American factories were producing so much of everything, food, medicine, equipment, clothing, that generosity was logistically feasible. But resources alone don't explain it. The explanation lies in the fundamental difference in ideology. Nazi Germany built its identity on racial supremacy, on the necessity of subjugating others to prove German worth. American democracy, imperfect, flawed, still wrestling with its own contradictions, was built on the proposition that all humans possessed inherent dignity. When German prisoners encountered American abundance, they weren't just seeing material wealth. They were seeing the physical manifestation of a different philosophy, a system where human life had enough value that saving enemy lives was considered worthwhile. The jacket wasn't just warmth, It was proof. Proof that the propaganda was lies. Proof that everything they'd been told about superiority was backwards. Proof that true strength doesn't require cruelty. Thousands of German women came home carrying American jackets, blankets, memories of surprising kindness. They returned to cities in ruins, to a nation that had to confront its crimes, to a future that demanded they build something new from the wreckage. Many of them, like Greta Schneider, became part of the generation that rebuilt Germany. Not the Germany of martial glory and racial purity, but a Germany based on different principles: democracy, human rights, international cooperation, the lessons learned in those prison camps, that abundance enables generosity, that strength allows mercy, that humanity persists even in war's aftermath, became part of the foundation of modern Europe. Because sometimes the most revolutionary act is simple decency. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is a jacket given to a cold enemy on a rainy April day. Sometimes victory isn't just about who wins the war, but about who remembers to stay human while fighting it.